Welcome to Bible over Brews, deep thoughts fermented over time and text. I come to you, Aaron Crude Juice for Verk, and I've got Gumby.
Hey, hola.
I've got Mike.
Howdy.
I've got, never mind, just quiet. I've got Zachariah. And Theo.
Hello.
Theo, you have got a great radio voice.
Oh, thank you very much.
And tonight we will be sipping on Falling Fruit from Masthead. We set out to create a beer that showcases two of our favorite fruits, tart apples and sweet peaches. This ale was brewed with a gentle malt character to hold up and accentuate the sweet peaches while still finishing as crisp as an apple on a sunny day. Falling Fruit is kept unfiltered to preserve all of its ripe fruit flavor and aroma. It's a 5.8 in ABV. Here we go.
Nobody reads like you do, Aaron. Nobody.
Thank you, sir.
Fallen fruit fermented all the way back from Genesis 3 in honor of George, who fell away from this podcast.
Conveniently.
Right? That's okay. I have everything set up for the next time he shows up. So right off the bat, a lot of head off of this one. It foamed right up.
Beautiful color.
Ooh, it's fragrant, though. It's very fragrant. You can see right through it. Oh, wow. That is way fruity.
Very fruity, but not sweet at all. I'm pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. You know what? Actually, I'm not going to pour the rest in the cup. Yeah, it actually tastes really a little bit stronger in the can.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I could see it. Once something hits the glass, it releases. So I could see it. But it's good. Yeah, it's not sweet, but it's definitely fruity. It has that pleasant aroma. It has a pleasant flavor. I like it.
Yeah, I was expecting more of a shandy, but it's not. It's just more
Yeah.
fruit essence in a beer.
Right. It's almost like the seltzer water I was drinking earlier. Good job, Masthead.
Yeah.
Oh,
And Theo, how you doing over there?
Just got the old H2O stuff, you know. I guess that's what people doing PhDs do, is drink water because they can't afford anything else.
We call that a Lake Erie highball.
So I'm in good company with David Burnett, you know, just H2O.
That's right. Yeah, he had a really good looking coffee. So what our listeners don't realize is that you don't come from the United States.
Well, not today, anyway.
So let's hear your background. You are from...
I'm from the Midwest, you know. All right. So, great state of Illinois.
oh.
But I've spent the last over a decade in Asia, although I've traveled around the world, and I'm currently in Nepal. So, out of Kathmandu.
Nice.
Wow.
So literally Kathmandu. See, we just put it in songs.
Well, I'm not a singer, so I'll just leave that up to you.
What time is it right now there?
Oh, I've been up since 4:00 in the morning waiting for George. It's about 5:34 in the morning, Monday morning. I'm east of you, so.
Yeah, don't feel guilty, George, about that.
Awesome.
Yeah, you got me out of bed.
Right.
Well, we apologize for that, but we are enjoying having you on.
Oh yeah, I'm just having fun. So you guys have so much fun with George. I just feel like I need to do it too.
So, question for you then: what does somebody from Illinois? How do you end up over in Kathmandu?
It's actually a crazy story. I don't know. It's been about 2007. I felt I was it was interesting because it's kind of like this podcast. I was at a church my friend was setting up the sound for a youth event. So I was kind of bored waiting on him to set up the sound and then waiting for the program to begin. So I was out in the foyer and I feel like the Lord had spoke to me that I needed to go to India. And I thought, what in the world? So I knew one person that had gone. And so I called him up and said, hey, I really feel like God wants me to go to India. I don't know why. I said, just set the trip up, and I'll send you a check. So, and he did, and I sent him the check. We got on the plane, we flew over, and spent about 2 weeks in the mountains of northern India, and really wasn't sure about what God wanted me to do. But by the end of the trip, I had a divine appointment with someone, and realized I needed to come over full time. So about 6 months later, after selling everything, I came over full time and served there with the ministry for about 8 years, and learned a lot. And then God began to reveal to me what He really wanted me to do. We'd been spending those 8 years a lot of time and effort in doing work from India into Nepal. And so I actually married a Nepalese. So God began to speak to me over a course of a year. He brought someone from Kathmandu into our ministry office, and other people that spoke into my life, and I realized I needed to go to Nepal full time. So in 2016, I ended up in Nepal full time.
Huh. Well, that's quite a story.
Packed my bags and just 2 suitcases and moved from India to Nepal.
It sounds like the premise of a book.
Yeah, if I ever get my dissertation done, maybe.
So you didn't see any Yeti up there, did you?
No, I haven't. I'm not really the tourist. I'm probably the only lame guy here that has never seen Mount Everest with his physical eyes. So they claim because of the lockdown that you could at one point see it from Kathmandu, but at the time I was out in a remote village. So I have not laid my physical native eyes on Mount Everest yet. So I don't know if you can see it now because they've kind of returned to polluting the air. So they've lifted the lockdown a little bit. So,
Wow.
But yeah, I haven't done many of the touristy things yet. So
I saw a documentary not too long ago where tours were happening there, right? And literally some of the landmarks finding your way on that mountain are dead bodies. Yeah, it's wild.
They recently cleaned things up for a little bit because it's getting too bad. And when they cleaned up all the trash, which they didn't get it all, but they did before the lockdown, they cleaned up a lot of the trash, and they found so many bodies they didn't realize when they cleaned it up. So they're trying to figure out, they want tourists. Tourism is the second largest moneymaker for the nation. And so they want tourists, so they changed a lot of the laws in regards to, but they didn't quite get it all the way through because they're afraid to make it too much laws, and then people won't come. And then the lockdown, the virus came in the lockdown, so it kind of ruined everything. But yeah, toward the end of the last season, they brought down a lot of trash, and they couldn't believe how many bodies they ended up finding. They're also years ago, I think the British, of course, but whoever, were instrumental in measuring the mountain, but because of the recent earthquakes in 2015, and we even had some just recently, where I was at in the village, we had another one. The original ones were over 7 point, and this what we experienced was along the lines of a 5.0, 4.9. But they're remeasuring the mountain, and Nepal wants to do it themselves this time. So to see if it's shrunk because of the earthquakes. But so I don't know if they're going to go up there and clean some more of the trash and maybe find more bodies. But you're right. They found a ton of bodies and brought them down from the mountain in the last years at the end of the last season.
Yeah.
Wow. I wonder who drew the short straws that had to grab the bodies and bring them down.
They didn't know they're going to find bodies. They were just cleaning the trash because, you don't bring it back with you, You just leave it there and it freezes or whatever. So.
Yeah. Man.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the professional hikers, the people who do it, like plan it out, they were like landmarks. Like they knew where to go based on like a dead body. Like that's just wild. Like when you see that.
Yeah, it's very difficult. You have to acclimate yourself. You can't go too high fast. Right now, the Chinese and the Indians are fighting over their border. And the Chinese have been moving troops and all kinds of things up to the border, and the Indians are kind of playing catch up, and you cannot move troops into the area in the high elevations too quickly because you get that disease that if you move too fast. And so they've had many people get sick, and some of them die because you cannot go, climb so high so fast. So you can't move just troops in there. They have to take their time to slowly acclimate. So you have that issue, the oxygen levels, you have the whole cold climate, everything. So yeah, it's Doctor Strange movie. It wouldn't work. He cannot just be that high. That's Hollywood. You have to acclimate. So
yeah.
Well, I guess we know who the Marvel fan in the room is.
Well, it's pretty popular around here. It's not every day. I think, what was it, Expendables 2 and Indiana Jones and a few others that record films here. So it's pretty popular when someone comes and films a film in your country and you're quite small. So.
Wow. That's kind of cool. And then also, before we go too far, we have Zechariah in the background that we've been trying to pull into the podcast for a while. How's it going?
Decent. Blasting out this stuff here.
Yeah, if you can speak up a little bit.
All right, yeah, pretty decent.
There we go, that's better. So
Just blasting out all this quarantine stuff. So.
Yeah, and he's done quite a bit of research, and he has a plethora of documents and books, and he's actually been working with Theo on some stuff. So
okay.
And where are you based, Zechariah?
Oh, I'm down here, Houston area, Texas.
All right.
Yeah. So, and there was he's one of the Magi. And that's a lot of the research that they've done in the background has been featured on the podcast and on the show. So that's why I've been trying to pull him in for forever.
Coming in out of the cold here.
Now, are you Catholic?
No.
Okay.
I'm pretty much in between things right now.
Oh no.
But I do have a lot of intersecting stuff that I deal with. Theological wise or scholarship wise.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always interesting.
It is.
He's known in certain circles. He's known as the Hound. But I've given him this distinction. When it comes to understanding all these things, I say he has his finger in just about every pie. So he doesn't land anywhere because he's always got, a taste of what's going on in just about every little corner to have an idea. So an inkling. So yeah.
Now,
I try to help out where I can.
Yeah, and he helps a lot, like you guys on your podcast, and some of my projects. Yes.
Yeah, he's done quite a bit of scholarship in the background. Some of the stuff he writes kind of blows me away. It's like, wow, that's more wordy than the way I would have put it.
And he's not even Catholic,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Now, is Theo Catholic?
What's that?
I'm sorry, Theo. Are you Catholic?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
I'm kind of all over the places myself as well. I've had different journeys with different time periods of different peoples, and now that I'm in Nepal, I'm just I've been a part of the Baptist here, and I'm doing a PhD at a Baptist university, but
okay,
I'm just kind of open to a lot of things because I'm trying to incorporate everyone here. In America, this is an example. In America, you have tons of different types of Baptists. They can be just about anything. But in Nepal, you only have one Baptist denomination. So, I want to be open to everything at the moment. So, yeah, I'm just kind of open and just wherever God has got me at the time. But I've done lots of different traditions in my past. So, yeah.
Wow, that's well, we appreciate the openness.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and then Heiser has actually inspired some of what you do, right?
Yeah, it was a big part. I went home in 2016, and I just moved to Nepal. And I'd explained to everybody that I'm no longer in India. Most people think that Nepal is a part of India. And right now the Chinese would like to say otherwise, and Nepal just wants to be by itself. But anyway, there's a local saying here that India and China are like two elephants that meet in a field. And whether they fight or whether they dance and love, Nepal's the grass between them and still going to get trampled. So,
Ouch.
Interesting.
Ouch.
so yeah, that's the local saying here. But anyway, kind of interesting. So yeah, Nepal is independent. It's got one of the distinctions of never being owned or controlled by any colonial power. It's always been independent. So yeah. So anyway, but it has that distinction currently. But the Chinese seem to. The Tibet government is that's kind of exiled. Not the Dalai Lama, but the government itself is actually concerned for Nepal and worried. So, but yeah, so Nepal's always been on its own per se. So they're they're a Hindu kingdom, but they've opened their borders for the mountains, and it brought the gospel in. And missionaries along the borders have tried to work for years, and they've had to break through. Some Catholics did some work a few centuries ago, but it didn't stick. And there is one Catholic church here. There used to be two, but it kind of died off. So the other one, so it didn't really stick, and they were thought to be like British spies or something. So they were kind of kicked out of the country. But in the 50s,
interesting,
missionaries began to come in, and then of course, when they opened up for tourism, it brought the gospel in a lot of ways. And then the 2015 earthquakes had a really big influence. I think in about 2012, they did a survey, 2011, 2012, for the last census. And at that time, that Nepal was slated to be the fastest growing church percentage-wise in all of Asia, because the gospel was really coming. And with the earthquake, the response by the Christians around the world brought so much into the country that, in the last decade, the church has grown to huge proportions. But at the same time, persecution has come because of it. So, so yeah.
So did you make a reference previously about the prosperity gospel?
Oh yeah, it's here. Everything's here. That's the problem. So that's why I'm kind of open. So I'm not necessarily tied to one group. So there's a lot of projects I want to do as soon as I finish my PhD. But that's one of them I've been asked to write on because it's very popular here. A lot of my students ask questions in regards to it. And there's a lot of abuse, of course, just like it is over there, where they teach the things. And so when they had their earthquakes, it's interesting. They had their earthquakes. And so in India, in the mountains, there's a place called Sikkim in the northern parts of India. It's just, if you look at the map of India, it looks like a thumb raised up, like Arthur Fonzarelli off of Happy Days, the thumb up, So that little thumb is called Sikkim. And originally, all these people were one, but the British wanted the tea gardens. They got to get the Queen some tea, so they kind of marched up, but they ran into the Gurkha soldiers, and they'd never met anything like it. So the Gurkhas, Nepali soldiers, were like, they would shoot them and they'd keep coming. They didn't have guns, but they had their big, huge knives, so they would take their machete type knives and just, the British would shoot them in the shoulder, a soldier's shoulder, and they'd keep coming at them. And they're like, wow. So the British have hired these guys. These guys are famous soldiers. When Donald Trump met North Korea, who did the security? The Nepali Gurkhas, So these guys are like world known for like the best soldiers ever. So, but anyway, the British couldn't take Nepal. And so they did get the thumb, they did get Darjeeling, and they got the tea gardens of Sikkim. And so there was a guy like Nostradamus over there, some great Christian prophet, supposedly, he predicted that there was going to be this great earthquake, and there was in Nepal. And so everybody's like, he's on YouTube, and it was like, wow, you predicted the earthquake. Well, anybody can predict stuff. So, all these prophets, and they all know what's going to happen. And so a fledgling community, it's a church that's, from the 1950s, born in the 1950s. The charismatic movement that swept across the world in the 60s took over. Sad, there's many tourists that come here looking for liturgy, and they can't find it. They can't find high church here because the charismatic wave pretty much has 90% of the churches worship in that manner. And so people looking for a higher church experience, is very difficult for them to find liturgy. But because of that, the influence of a young fledgling church. And so they've been, with their newfound faith, they've been very much influenced by the charismatic movement, and thus the prosperity gospel. And yeah, if you'd say there's an earthquake coming and it happens, wow, you must be from God. So there's a lot of cults that come out of, especially, we have our cults that we're familiar with, where you put different ones in your view, but Jehovah's Witness usually gets the top of the list. They're here. Mormons are here. Different groups are here, obviously, working, but there's a lot from South Korea, which people don't realize. In South Korea, some of the largest churches in the world. But then they have Aung San Hong, who, came down and said, "I'm Jesus." And interesting story for your audience. His first wife claimed that she was the bride of Christ, and so he wrote a book saying, "No, she's not. I'm Jesus, but she's nothing." So then he got remarried, and when he died, his second wife.
It's a good thing they clarified that.
His first wife. And she says, "I'm the New Jerusalem. I'm the bride of Christ. I'm all these things in Revelation." And they're very big over here. That church is huge over here. So Mother God Church is what the common pop language is. They have a long title. I don't know what it is, but anyway. So they go around and they teach the Bible, and they tell the people that we're Christian. We'll take your son to Korea for a visa and job and 3 years Bible training, and we'll give him, all these things. And so the parents are like, "Yes, please, because there's no jobs here. There's nothing here." So, so they go and they get taught all this stuff for 3 years, and then they come back and they try to evangelize everyone else. And so there's a lot of cults here. So they fall prey to so many things because theology is the theology community is trying to rise up. They just now got their MDiv program through. My pastor was under a hybrid program for about 6 years, and now they have like 3 universities offering MDivs in country for the first time, and they're trying to move toward offering eventually their own PhD programs in country. Otherwise, you've had to go outside the country to get training, and of course, everybody wants to leave anyway, but it's very difficult to get people to go outside and get trained and then come back and try to live for the people. And so the theology here is very young. And sad to say, I know that Juice won't like this, but historical theology is like nil. I talked to one of the heads of theology from America that used to be here full time, and now he's had to go back to the States. But when he was outlining, the steps to get to a PhD, and he's like, unfortunately, we just don't have much historical theology. That there's not much emphasis on the fathers or anything because we're trying to do all the other things. So it's kind of like last on the list, and so it's not, being done. Maybe it's the highest fruit on the tree. I don't know, and they just haven't climbed that high to get that high fruit. I don't know, and so they're grabbing the low hanging fruit. So yeah, it's very, very primitive, and so they fall prey to things like the prosperity gospel or these cults or things because they don't have knowledge. Many people in the villages, to be pastor, all you have to do is be able to read. Because most people, older people in the village, they don't even know how to read.
Wow.
So it's actually,
if you can read, you're pastor.
It's actually very humbling to hear because we still have so much of that here, but yet we consider ourselves so advanced, so privileged, so exceptional. So, keep on going, et cetera, et cetera. But yet we still have so much of that here. So it for me, it makes me self-reflect and say, how young are we spiritually still here?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and Juice has told me that, he became Catholic, and I heard his testimony. I'm sure the listeners have all heard it. And the recent
once or
podcast,
twice.
even Dr. Heiser mentioned that he's teaching at his parish.
Mm-hmm.
And, you think about the rich tradition of the Catholic Church. Of course, they're opposed to private interpretation, which is the big problem, when you have somebody coming in and say, I predicted the earthquakes, and I'm, I'll tell you what the Bible says. Private interpretation. And most Catholics don't know the scriptures. There's a lot of them that do, obviously, but there's some that don't know. They just, but they do. They know it. They know the liturgy. They just don't know, where it's at in their Bible. But, he's able to teach a lot of things in his church as a new Catholic, because he knows the Bible so well. There's a lot of people that don't know the Bible. And when I came over in 2016, I was following, what I felt God was telling me, and I didn't know what he wanted me to do. And then what happened was, I went home in 2016 to get back to Juice's question. And a guy that has introduced some really crazy stuff to me in the past. And I'm like, I really don't know. He gave me some books, and I'm like, they're still in America. So if he listens to this podcast, I'm sorry, but I was like, that was some really strange stuff. So that was on a previous trip. I'm like, I don't have room in my suitcase for that. So I left it. But he says, you got to get Logos Bible software. I'm like, who can afford that? That's like, they don't want your right arm. They want like 10 arms, who can afford that? and you got to listen to Mike Heiser. I'm like, the last stuff you gave me is pretty crazy. So I'm like, I don't know. So whatever, so it's like just about like what we're doing right here, just three of us gathered around a table, just shooting the breeze. And the two of us listen to this guy, and he's given some really crazy stuff in the past. And so the other guy and I are like looking at each other, and we're like, okay. So then I come back to Nepal, and I'm like, okay, I feel like God wants me to teach. That's my greatest gift. And so, but where am I going to teach? How am I going to teach people that don't understand? So I get the scene. And so God begins to open doors, and then I got an opening to teach at a college, but then I needed to finish my master's. I hadn't finished my master's degree, and obviously they wanted me to get my PhD, and I'm like, wow, how do I do that? So God began to open doors. I found a university, it's Baptist University, that was able to allow me to get in their program and transfer in everything and do. And so I was like, that's great. And so I met with my advisor, and he said, so how are you going to study? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you're in Nepal. Obviously, there's nothing there. And I hadn't met Zachariah yet, so I didn't have the PDF king of the world, So I'm like, how are you going to do your research? I'm like, I don't know.
The PDF.
He says, well, you're going to have to get something like Logos Bible software. I'm like, okay, so that was the door that I realized I needed to get that. So when I went and got Logos Bible software, of course, when I pull up everything and start trying to figure out what to get, there's Mike Heiser all over Logos Bible software. I'm like, okay. So then I get his stuff. So I'm working on my master's, and I'm like trying to teach classes. So they hired me in January of 2017 to teach one class as a test to see, okay, we don't know you, so let's see what happens. So that week finished, and they called me as I got home. They called me and says, on Monday you have another class. So after 1 week, I'm supposed to be on trial for 3 months, and then after 1 week, they're like, you have another class on Monday. So I'm trying to figure out how to do my master's and teach 2 classes at the drop of a hat. And then, at the same time, I'm like trying to figure out what to do to teach these classes. And then I'm like, okay, Heiser just keeps popping up. I'm like, all right, I've got to see this Heiser stuff. And so I started messing with his podcast and started messing with his book, The Unseen Realm, and I was immediately hooked. It was just like, it drew me in. And those of you, even the listeners, or those of you that are familiar with this podcast, and of course listen to his previous podcast here or visited his podcast, but all of that stuff about it, the supernatural and everything, which is great for where I'm at, I'm in a world of 330 million gods, so all of that fits. But what really grounded me into Heiser was he got me into scholarship. He became my mentor because I'm doing all my degree remote online. So, and I'm at a very small university. So, they do the best they can, but usually when you pursue academic degree, you go find somebody to mentor you and you go to their college because you want them to teach you, and they're sitting there because everything you need is there because that's where they study. So they're there. If you've listened to Mike Heiser's podcast, Naked Bible Podcast with David Instone Brewer on divorce and remarriage, he talks about why he's sitting where he's at in UK, because in walking distance he can go to Oxford, Cambridge. I mean, he's got like all the major libraries, so that's why he's there. So I begin to, through Heiser, this whole paradigm shift into the supernatural worldview of the Bible. At the same time, I begin to understand scholarship and how you're to approach the text. And it's not private interpretation. That you enter into the world of academics and you're entering into a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years, not 2,000 years, but more than 3,000 years. And you enter into that conversation and you begin to look at the text the way it was received. You begin to look at Genesis, how when the ink was wet, when the author finished and the ink is wet still, it hasn't dried yet, okay? Or it may not be ink, but anyway, whatever they used, depending. But what did the message mean back then? And trying to get that. And so all the things that I learned from Dr. Heiser's work of the supernatural worldview of the Bible, but more importantly, at the same time, I began to learn how to study the Bible properly. And his first, 35 episodes before Trey came on and trying to figure out all that and begin to work through the Bible. And then I was able to bring that to the classroom. And my students were like floored, and bringing Bible project videos to them and introducing biblical theology and bringing all these things. And then, of course, through Heiser's community, back when I was able to be on Facebook, I met Juice, I met Zechariah, and many others. And so that's how I began to have conversations with them and begin to understand things and then begin to ask Zechariah so many questions, and he keeps answering them. So he hasn't gone away yet. So. So yeah, I continue. At one time, I was doing my master's thesis, and I was teaching at a number of institutions. I was teaching a course load of 8 subjects. So in 6 semesters, 3 years' time, I taught 20 different subjects, and many of those subjects multiple times.
Yeah, keep moving you around.
So. My course load of teaching has just been absolutely ridiculous because situations happen over here. Most pastors are not well paid, obviously, at all, unless they can find some foreign sponsors. And usually the pastor of the church is the financial also of the church. So the church is operating off of whatever the pastor brings. And so if he doesn't have foreign support, or if he does and he's using it to help so many families in the church, often they have to get jobs. So often they teach, like at a Bible college. That's one of the ways they can do. And then they try to get a job that way. And so, but then their ministry constantly pulls them. And so they don't always make it up. But I take my teaching very seriously, and it's what God has called me to do primarily. So then I'm there. I show up every day. If it rains or whatever, I'm there. And so I'm consistent. So I usually end up taking classes a lot of times from different pastors or whatever. For whatever reason, they have to drop their class and they can't teach it because of their ministry requires them or something. And so they're not able to do it. So yeah, that was a nightmare, teaching very early in the morning, getting out on my bicycle and going to different institutions teaching and coming home late at night, and then trying to figure out somewhere in between to study all the material I needed to teach the classes, but at the same time try to write something of my thesis and get it done. It was crazy times. So do all my classes and teach at the same time. So it was crazy.
No
I think I
doubt.
had 6 classes I was trying to deal with too myself. So I was trying to finish out, different materials for different classes. It was crazy. It was crazy times. Yeah. So unreal.
Yeah, and with the pressure that's going on, because you said that there's that the government itself, with the pandemic and the shifting back and forth, has been causing issues for you as well.
Oh yeah, the church in general is facing lots of problems. The
Mm.
church, Christianity, like I said, it's an anomaly. It showed up in the 50s. I mean, they got rid of it when they got rid of the Catholics, several hundred years ago. It showed up, and there's nothing legal. When they created the Constitution, they went through a long civil war to get rid of their king. Nepal's history is a bunch of kingdoms,
Hmm.
and then eventually one king ruled them all. So, king of the hill, he threw all the other kings off the mountain, so he took over. And, that family ruled for a long time. And finally, the communist pressure from the Maoist and different parties finally, through a very vicious civil war, finally broke through, and they began to hammer out a constitution. And but in that constitution, it was a Hindu kingdom, and now there's Buddhists here, there's Muslims here, and there's Christians and different things. But the Christians have no legal standing whatsoever. It wasn't built into the Constitution at all. Yeah, totally opposite of America. You have a group of people who created a constitution with Christianity basically deleted, the opposite, with no view of Christianity whatsoever. So there's no legal standing for churches at all. One of the things that I remember, there's one of the oldest churches in Kathmandu. They bought their ground, and so your land, you're buying land, or they're constantly selling land. So it could have had 100 owners before. It's just been sold, bought, sold so many times down through the centuries or whatever, tracking it through, and since the Civil War, different ones buy it and sell it. So in the Constitution, there's a law that says that if a piece of property, used to belong to a temple at any time in its history, then it can always revert back. It can always revert back to that ground, to the temple. And so a church, one of the oldest churches in Nepal, survived the earthquake. They, spent all this time and effort to get all this money to buy the land and to build this beautiful church. That part of that land used to be owned way back when by a temple. It's part of the temple grounds. And now the government wants to raise the church and say, no, the land has to go back to the temple because it was holy ground. It originally belonged to the temple. It needs to go back to the temple. It cannot worship other God. It cannot be. So one of the oldest churches you're talking about, when hikers hike and they see dead bodies, this is the way to go. Well, when Christians look at the church in Nepal and their church history, there's that church, well, the government wants to raise it now. So I don't know, the virus kind of slowed things down if they're still going to raise that church, but it's very difficult. So the government is very anti-Christian. The people are anti-Christian. I'm trying to get land of my own because at any time the landlord can throw me out because I'm a Christian. He disagrees. So it's very difficult. We just closed our church. We planted the church, and the place we're renting, it's not possible to in the pandemic to afford to pay the rent, especially when you're not using it. Churches are all closed, and we don't know if they're going to be allowed to open because they have no legal standing. No church really has technically the deed in its name because they're not a legal entity, so it has to be in some person's name. Even bank accounts can't be necessarily in a church's name. So, if a landlord can just tell you get out because it's happened numerous times. One of our partner churches, the landlord said, "Go, get out. We don't want Christians meeting here. We don't want virus." That was before Nepal actually took the virus very seriously, but they were kicked out because they're afraid. In South Korea, a woman went to church. And the South Koreans are one of the most prepared people in the world for the virus because they've already dealt with SARS and MERS and all this stuff. They did the research. They have all the protocols in place. But this lady broke protocol, went to church, and got hands laid on her to be healed in Jesus' name. And hundreds of people from that, these are some of the largest churches in the world, hundreds of people from that meeting got sick. And within a matter of, weeks, we're talking almost 10,000 or 4,000 people got sick in Korea because one lady went to church. And so the Nepal government's like, oh, we got to shut down churches. We can't have people because the Christians are the source of the virus. So all that stuff, you have all this idea that the Christians are bad, that because they gather every week, because they lay hands on each other, they touch each other, they, all these things. We got to get rid of the church. So it's been very difficult time. So the pastor he lost his job. A Christian college closed down indefinitely because they just can't raise funds during the virus. And they're not getting funding, and everyone's focused on the virus in their own country. So mission funding has gone way down. So they had to close their campus. So he was living there. He was getting everything there as warden, all of his food, everything. So all he has is his clothes. So he's been asked by the end of the month, July, to get out. He has to find a place to live, which is very difficult to find someone who rent a room to a Christian. And then what's going to happen to the church, we don't know. Churches are trying to meet online, but how to find another place. And people are saying, no, we don't want Christians. We don't want a church. We don't want you to rent our piece of property. Of all the Baptist churches in the Kathmandu Valley, there's only 2 Baptist churches that actually own the property. Everyone else is renting. So because I'm with the Baptists, I kind of get their statistics. But I'm sure the same for a lot of other churches. They don't own the property; they just rent. And so a lot of the number one moneymaker for Nepal is people go outside the country and work in another nation. And now they're all getting laid off. Well, not all, but there's many getting laid off. And they're being sent back to Nepal. So they're going to be coming back. They're going to be looking for jobs. They're going to be looking for places to stay. So it's going to get very difficult to find rooms as it is because all these people are coming back by the droves. Every day the airplanes are bringing in people, and they're all going to be looking for places to rent, jobs, food. And, it's going to be very difficult to find a room. And if you're a Christian, they're like, no, we don't want you. We don't want you. And if you're definitely going to have church here, no, we don't want you. You can't worship here. So it's extremely difficult for the church because they have no standing. They're in the minority, but they're treated. They have a caste system here based on when the one king that kicked all the other kings off and took over the country. They developed a caste system like the Bible because this is Bible over Brews. In the Bible, you have 2 tribes that are. Of the 12 that stick out. You have the Judah tribe, that's the rulers, and you have the priestly caste, the tribe, that's the Levites. They have the same in the Hindu religion. They have the Brahmins, who are the highest because of the priest, but then they have the rulers, the Kshetris. They're the ruling class, and so they were the ones that did government, so they had all the power to do everything. And so they're the 2 high castes. But you have many low castes, and you're familiar with probably generally most people are familiar with the low caste, the Dalits, the untouchables. But when you're a Christian, you're no longer caste. You're not low caste. You're outcast. You're just not. You're nothing. So you're worse because you've rejected. We're a Hindu kingdom now. We're a democracy, but we're still Hindu. And so you've rejected 330 million gods. Surely you can find one God. Just add Jesus. You go. Surely you can just accommodate. Just add Jesus. Make it 330 million and one. What's the big deal? Why can't you just get along? So it's very difficult. So Christians are considered of no caste. And so one of my early trips to Nepal, I was out in the village, and the guy that could speak English was Brahmin, because his father had the money to send him to this boarding school where he could learn English. So he stopped by in the village where I was at and talked to me a lot. And he came one day, he was talking to me, he said he's quite thirsty. And so he'd gone down to the low castes, and the mountain at the top is the road where all the Brahmins live, and then down next is like the Chetris, and then it goes down, and when you get to the bottom of the valley, down to the low spot, that's where the Dalits are at. So he'd gone down there to do what they call puja, worship, to do what he does as a priest. And then they give him money, paisa in the Nepali language. They give him money. And so he goes and does what he does, and they give him money. But then he cannot drink their water, okay, which is in their language is pani. But anyway, so he can't drink their water. Okay, so he's gone down there, and then he has to climb back up to get to his house. So he's all tired, and he's sweating, and it's quite warm. It was in the hot season, and so he's wanting some water, but he couldn't drink their water, okay, because they're low caste. But he could take their money. I couldn't understand. So drink their pani, but could take their paisa, but not their pani. Take their water, but not their money. So no, I can't take your water, but I'll take your money. I think it'd be the opposite. But anyway, being, ministry or whatever. But so he stopped by our place to get something to drink because he could drink the water where I was staying because they're higher caste. So I can drink the water here. Some people can come and sit on your porch, but they cannot come in your house. And some people can't even step on your porch. And some people can't even really go to your village at all. They're not supposed to come. So you're talking a caste system, and then Christians are even worse than that. So the Hindus don't want you inside their property. They don't want you there because they'll be cursed by their gods because you come and you're Christian and you're not part of the caste. So yeah, it's very difficult for Christians here. So the persecution of the government and everything. So yeah, it's quite difficult to be a Christian in Nepal.
That's interesting because you'd think if there's that many gods, what's one more, right?
Exactly. That's the logic. What's the problem with one more? I mean, what's the big deal?
So
go ahead and do what you do. That's fine.
Let me ask a question in honor of George.
All right.
To honor George. So I hope it's, and I don't mean it to be offensive at all. But I'm taking off my Christian hat, and I'm going to ask this question. Historically, you're telling me that Christians have been rejected there and pushed out, for a long time, and because they have their culture, they have their religions, and that's what they want. So I could see George asking, he was like, why do Christians feel the need to keep on forcing a different theology, a different religion in an area that's not theirs when they don't want it? You know what I mean? So I don't know if that question makes sense. And I don't necessarily mean this toward you, but just in Christianity in general, going into Nepal in that area.
Well, if Gumby could answer the question as a recovering evangelical, he obviously knows the Great Commission and why most evangelicals
I do, but I took off my Christian hat for this question.
Yes. Well, I'm asking Gumby to answer. He understands from an evangelical perspective why the Great Commission and everything. Of course, even Dr. Heiser mentioned that in the last podcast that he was on about the importance of the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. But then Jews, as a Catholic, their higher church, their higher tradition is not known for being so evangelical that, if you don't accept Jesus, you're going to burn in hell kind of thing, preaching that fire, hellfire, and brimstone. So they have a little bit different take on that. And so I'm trying to understand in what Dr. Heiser does for any of your audience, and John Walton, they do something called comparative studies where they understand the Old Testament, not from the fathers, not from the New Testament. Walton is very opposed to that. They understand the Old Testament and the Israelite religion by comparing it with the religions surrounding them in the ancient Near East. It's called comparative studies. But there's another field that I don't know if there's any podcast on, where certain systematic theologians have gone into what's called comparative theology. And one of my former students is doing a master's in math because he can't get a master's, he can't get the support or whatever he needs to get a master's in divinity. He's an incredible guy. But this is how, let my student answer your question, George. Okay. He thinks that, well, it was said like this. In South India, I was told by Nepali, one of my colleagues that teaches at the college. In South India, there's a famous guru who said that you can't believe Christians because Christians, although they only have one God, Jesus, they don't agree on Jesus. You can't find two Christians to agree, But at the same time, my colleague said, if you stop and talk to a Hindu on the street and ask him questions, and then the next Hindu that comes to you and ask him, you're going to get probably two entirely different answers. There's no two Hindus that necessarily agree on what they do. Of course, they have 330 million gods, so you have this diverse kind of thing going on. But what my student said is none of it's necessarily what you call orthodox. So most people on the street have a pop religion, like you mentioned earlier. Most even Christians don't even really know what the Bible says. For years I read the Bible and I thought for sure I knew what it meant by the Holy Spirit. And now I study it out and go, that's not at all what it meant. It can't mean that. I've been wrong about so many things. That's why I love theology. It's changing me. But he said the same thing about the Hindu religion, the Buddhist religion, or the Muslim religion. Now, when you go into it academically and you try to get true Orthodox belief, it's not what the people on the street believe. And what he wants to do is he wants to get Orthodox Christianity and what the Bible really says and what the church, the tradition, what is really meant academically, like Heiser or some of these scholars, and then compare it to Buddhism from their scholar and compare it to, Hindu. So I asked my philosophy professor who taught world religions, and I never got to take that class. I was so sad because it was always overbooked, and I couldn't get it in my schedule in my undergrad. I said, I think they're going to ask me to teach world religions. They didn't, but I thought they were. I said, how do you do it? He says, well, I just tell my students to buy the cheapest copy off of Amazon of the text of the other religions, like the Quran and the Gita and all these other books.
Yeah.
And then I have them read the text for themselves.
Join us for the rest of the conversation in part 2.